Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here early in the morning. I appreciate today is the last day of the public forum, and therefore sometimes it's really hard to wake up and come. So I really appreciate that. Thanks to the WTO for letting us have this space to discuss these important issues. And I want to say a special thanks also to the Sahara Dalam Malaysia and the World Labor Institute for organizing this important panel. We are going to pass around some sign-up sheets that you can sign with your name and your email in case you want to receive further information. We are going to do that in case you want to know more about the speakers, the work they do, and more information about what we're going to speak in this table. Okay, so carbon border adjustment mechanisms are being implemented and planned in a number of regions around the world. For example, the transition phase of the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism entered into force on 1st of October 2023. This session will examine the implications of the CBAMs for climate change, the transition to low carbon economies, sustainable development, and inclusive growth. It would also provide suggestions for a positive trade and environment agenda at the WTO. So to discuss these important issues, we have four distinguished speakers that are here with me at the table. The first one that is going to take the floor is Ms. Kolelwa Mulumbi Peter. She has served as South African Chief Negotiator and Deputy Director General in the International Trade and Economic Division at the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition since October 2014. She has led South Africa's trade negotiation with various partners, including the European Union, the UK, and the Mercosur, in several multilateral platforms such as the G20, BRICS, and the Commonwealth. Ms. Mulumbi Peter joined the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition as Director, NEPAD AAU, in September 2005 and was appointed as a Chief Director of the African Multilateral Economic Relations in May 2008 to drive regional economic integration in Africa. She is an accredited Center of Effective Dispute Resolution Mediator, and in 2021 served as the Chair for the TRIPS Council of the WTO. In her current role as ambassador to the WTO, she has been active in advancing the interest of the African group and developing countries broadly on WTO and other trade-related issues. So, Ms. Mulumbi Peter, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning to everyone. We start from the premise that we do recognize the need to deal with climate change because it has actually a disproportionate effect on developing countries. And we also recognize the need for global cooperation, especially when it comes to adaptation measures. Of course, as the Chair has said, we are now seeing a worrying trend of a rise in unilateral protectionist measures that are implemented under the guise of the environment. And these measures have significant impact on developing countries in terms of their ability to access key global markets. At the first inaugural Africa Summit, which was held earlier this month, African leaders have called on the world to appreciate the fact that the issue of decarbonizing the global economy will require that we look at it from a position of equality and shared prosperity. As we all know, the African continent contributes least to global emissions, but unfortunately, we are the worst affected, both in terms of its effects, and not only its effects on the environment, but also in terms of the socio-economic development implications. A study by the Africa Climate Foundation has highlighted the effects of CBAM in terms of African exports as well as Africa's competitiveness. And it shows that Africa's GDP will be cut by 25 billion per annum given the affected sectors and the fact that we are still heavily reliant on mainly coal for our energy needs. And the study further shows that exports by developing countries across the targeted carbon-intensive sectors will be reduced by 1.4% if the CBAM is implemented at a price of $44 per ton. But of course, if it is doubled to $88 per ton, the decrease in GDP will be 2.4%. So this is really significant. In the case of South Africa, we are, of course, implementing our part of the bargain in terms of implementing our national determined contribution targets. And we also have a clear investment plan to get into renewable energy in terms of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. We, however, are really concerned by the effects of CBAM. The CBAM's effect in terms of the South African economy, the research shows that it will have an annual effect of 1.5 billion in terms of cost to the GDP per annum. And this is because we, of course, the various sectors that are currently covered by the CBAM, their exposure will depend on whether, well, firstly, the exposure to the EU market, secondly, the carbon intensiveness of the sector, and the key sector that will be affected is the iron and steel. Because, of course, it's still heavily reliant on coal-powered electricity, and it's also struggling in terms of improving its own efficiencies. And if we look at, for example, aluminium has 40% exposure to the EU market, but at least at this stage, given that it is based on indirect emissions, it is not, which are not covered currently under the CBAM. So at this stage, it is not currently affected. But of course, if the CBAM applies to indirect emissions, then the impact on the aluminum sector will be quite significant. But we also know that you have, for example, Mozambique, which is an LDC, given again the carbon intensity of its own sector in terms of aluminium, the impact on Mozambique will be quite huge. So I think while we recognize, as I said from the beginning, the fact that we all have to take measures, adaptation and mitigation measures to address the effects of climate change, what is important will be to ensure that we look at the least trade restrictive measures that can be implemented. But also importantly, we look at the unintended consequences of the measures that we are implementing. There will be, of course, as I said, trade-related effects to the implementation of CBAM in terms of our ability to access, key markets. And of course, for South Africa, the EU market is a significant market for us, as I've already indicated. But the implications go beyond trade. In our view, it also will have an impact on investments. And while, of course, at this stage, from the 1st of October, the CBAM is not really implemented, but of course, we have to start reporting in terms of the carbon content in our exports. If you look at that, what will happen is that if our sectors or our exporters are not able to report on the carbon content, the chances are we will feel an immediate impact because suppliers will start looking at those who are able to comply in terms of the reporting requirements. And we will see a disruption in supply chains. We will see a disruption in jobs. We will see a disruption in terms of the export-led growth of many developing countries. And that is a key concern for us. The second issue is the administrative and compliance burden of CBAM, given these reporting requirements. Already, our big players in the market are saying there will be a significant cost in terms of measuring the carbon content. You can imagine what the impact will be on MSMEs. So we really believe that there is a need to have a thorough debate. In the WTO, we also have to have a thorough debate multilaterally so that at the end of the day, we look at cooperative measures that will incentivize the private sector, of course, to reduce the carbon content. But at the same time, we need to avoid punitive measures, because the way we see the CBAM at this stage is a punitive measure, and its effect, and I'm sure Rashmi will speak to this, the study by UNCTAD shows that in terms of the CBAM's contribution to actual reduction of a carbon emission is quite limited at 0.1%. So you have a heavily or a heavy instrument that will have significant impact on trade and investment of developing countries, but very minimal effect in terms of contribution to actual reduction of the emissions. So we really need to look at measures that are commensurate with the effect that we are trying to achieve. And we believe that if we have a global discussion and a multilateral discussion, we can find mechanisms, as I said, that are based on cooperative principles rather than, penalties. The BRICS ministers met in August. And if you look at the BRICS trade ministers' statement on strengthening the multilateral trading system, they have raised concerns with regards to the impact of unilateral measures, of course, that I've said are implemented under the guise of the environment. What they have emphasized is the fact that the biggest concern is that these measures are having extraterritorial application, and they are imposing unnecessary and unjustified cost, and there are barriers to trade. They have called for concrete multilateral outcomes at MC13 that will ensure that we have coherence between trade policy measures and multilateral environmental objectives and principles. And they have called for a need to ensure that the measures that we implement in the context of climate change and environment should really lead to fair competition, should avoid unnecessary barriers to trade, and they have called for a need to have a multilateral discussion so that we can look at measures that will significantly reduce the impact on trade. In conclusion, I think we all recognize the need to contribute to addressing the effects of climate change. And we all respect and recognize the need that we need to act, because everyone recognizes that, the climate change is not a myth. Climate change affects people. Climate change affects developing countries, as I said, disproportionately so. But we do believe that there are principles that should underpin how we respond to this issue. One, we need to avoid unilateral measures. We need to ensure that the measures that we implement are not arbitrary. We need to ensure that they are WTO consistent. We need to also ensure that they adhere to the principles of the UNFCCC. The principle of common but differentiated responsibility, the need to recognize the historical contribution of those who have industrialized before. And what is also important, as I said, as we look at the cooperative mechanisms, we believe that there is a need for mobilization of finance to assist, especially the adaptation measures for developing countries, and in particular African countries. Secondly, they need to ensure affordable and equitable access to the requisite technologies to deal with the effects of climate change. I think we need to recognize that no number of measures can insulate any region from the effects of climate change. So what is needed is cooperation, and what is needed is inclusive action, and what is needed is also to ensure the historical responsibilities that others have to bear. Let me stop there, Chair. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Kolelwa. Our second speaker will be Ashish Chandorkar. He's a counselor at the Permanent Mission of India in the World Trade Organization. He covers the topics of non-agriculture market access, environment, and e-commerce. Ashish has more than 2 decades of experience in management consulting and banking industries, and now is doing a stint with the government. So the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Good morning to everyone who is here in the room and those of us who have joined us online early in the morning. Before I start, I would like to echo what the ambassador of South Africa said, that we are not debating the need to act on the issue of the climate crisis. What we are discussing and debating is the mechanisms or the instruments of doing so. I would also like to acknowledge that while we are discussing the idea of the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, this is not just about the first instance which EU has implemented and will get into force next month, because other members are also contemplating the same measure, and sooner or later we will have many more instances of CBAMs around us. So the discussion today is not just about one CBAM, but rather the broad idea of what CBAMs should or should not do. So we have, from an Indian perspective, we have in the various committees in WTO and various forums, we have spoken about five broad problems that we see with the idea of CBAM. So firstly, the idea of leakage, in this case, the carbon leakage, that itself militates against the notion of competitive advantage. And this has been actually the backbone of international trade for centuries. So we haven't had the idea of leakage defined in the WTO texts. And it could be interpreted differently by different members. And what is to say that today we are talking about carbon leakage, but then tomorrow this could be extended to other fields? What if someone says there's a leakage of minimum wages or other socioeconomic parameters? So if the members start adjusting, quote unquote, for leakage, then we open a Pandora's box here in terms of erecting measures, which definitely will be trade restrictive and which will have a disproportionately negative impact on the developing countries. So this idea itself needs to be discussed more, and that discussion actually is going on in the various WTO forums. Secondly, the carbon mechanisms, also the carbon border adjustments, have been defined as trade-related climate measures or trade-related environment measures. That's the terminology which is typically used when these measures are talked about. So it clearly means that these measures are in dual domain. They are part of international trade law as well as international environment law. But this term may seem innocuous, but in fact, it has a very important implication. This characterization may potentially be used by any proponent to say that because this is actually only trade related, but not a trade measure, hence WTO should not have any oversight in discussing the validity or applicability of these measures. So we would then get into a situation where the laws from either the trade legal domain or the environment legal domain do not fully apply, because it could be described as either, depending on how the proponents want to justify it. And that we see again as a big problem, because unless we recognize that this is going to have a trade implication, it is very difficult to really support these kind of ideas, especially in the context of WTO. Also, because if we are saying that these are environmental measures, then we would expect that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities is applied in full to these measures. The notion of CBDR-RC has existed in international environment law for a long time. And as we know, the environment law actually precedes the modern version of WTO by several years. In fact, in 1972, in the Stockholm Conference, which is when the countries around the world multilaterally started to discuss the idea of common responsibilities, the whole notion of CBDR-RC is very much baked in that discussion since 1972. It was codified in a declaration in Rio in 1992, which was actually a couple of years before WTO itself came into existence in its current form. So to say that CBDR-RC will not be applicable or will not be factored in a design of in a measure which the proponents seek to justify as an environment measure, then again, is not consistent with the idea of the international environmental law. So what we believe is that for a measure which is a hybrid of both trade and environment, the principles of both trade and environment should apply to the design. And again, we have spoken about this in the committees in WTO very, very vocally. Thirdly, the idea of CBAM is also perhaps against the commitments which were made by different countries in Paris in 2015. And of course, some of those commitments have also been updated since then. The idea of these climate commitments was that they were supposed to be nationally determined commitments. This was important because each country has perhaps a different pathway to achieve their own climate objectives. And again, to stress, it is not to say that we are not working towards achieving those objectives, but the determination of how we get there, the end point is agreed, but the path to that end point was supposed to be specific for each country, each member of these multilateral forums. And I think the measures which are currently being discussed, the way, for example, EU has designed it, that actually impinges upon the sovereign rights of other WTO members, and in a unilateral fashion, as the ambassador of South Africa also pointed out. So it is quite possible that a particular trading partner of EU or other members who enact CBAMs, they may have chosen their own priorities for a net zero ambition. But now with CBAM commitments, there has to be a reallocation of scarce national resources and limited preparation capabilities in the government and in the business areas, business sectors, to first put up or first prioritize the sectors which are being covered under CBAMs. So for example, starting next month, there's a reporting obligation for sectors in India's context. Steel and aluminum become the two major sectors where we have to start looking at what these obligations are. So also in future, the expansion of any CBAM or a new member enacting a new CBAM would definitely have more sectors covered. So in that sense, now the pathway of net zero transition for the trading partners has now been externalized in some way through these measures, and the trading partners will have to respond to those design measures. Yet another thing which perhaps has not been thought about is that if there are 2, 3, 4, or 5 CBAMs, would they talk to each other in the first place? So if I have a small exporter who's in, say, iron and steel sector, would that small exporter have to comply with 4 or 5 different reporting obligations? Would it be sufficient that they collect data once and they report to multiple agencies? Perhaps not, because each national agency will have their own way of implementing these CBAMs. So it is not just trade restrictive in the context of trade with one member. It actually becomes significantly more complex when a same company or same firm is exporting to multiple members with their own CBAMs. And that would essentially mean that the burden of compliance will be so high that some firms would just decide not to be in the export markets, or perhaps have to significantly change their business strategies. So this is not just disruptive from a trade perspective. This is actually disruptive in a broad sense for the entire economy, for that particular sector. And the fifth point that we have been speaking about is that the firms who are exporting to the EU in the current reporting obligation will be required to share a lot of data and information about their production processes and their competitive advantage. Many times what happens is that the importers get goods from multiple firms or multiple sources, and a single consignment is created for export. Now, in this case, there could be situations where the data of multiple firms has to be pooled together. So would those firms be open to sharing data with each other, because they are effectively in a commercial competition? So how would the reporting obligations take care of the fact that there could be pressure on firms to disclose their commercially sensitive information about their own supply chains? And this becomes a big area of concern, especially where firms who are innovating in new technologies, but instead of making or getting advantage of that investment, they will have to now share data quite openly, not just with the agents who are exporters or importers, but also with national authorities of other countries, whoever are implementing or whoever is governing this regulation, which would then mean that their data is exposed both nationally and internationally. And then that questions their investments in new technologies. So in our case, as I mentioned, the biggest impact is in steel and aluminum sectors. But unfortunately, even there, the worst negative impact of the design will be borne by the MSMEs who do not operate integrated plants, especially integrated steel plants, and depend on upstream players. Will large upstream players disclose their direct and indirect emissions to small downstream buyers? Why would they do so? Because again, it's a question of a competitive advantage here. And if they don't disclose, then how would those producing downstream products meet their reporting obligations in the first place? So, and to top it all, what is happening is that specifically in the case of steel, where one of the ways to produce cleaner steel is to use scrap. But for example, EU is now contemplating a restriction or a ban on sending scrap to countries outside of a limited set of countries. So if we can't use scrap, which is currently a better way of better feedstock for production of steel, and we have to also invest in technologies at a very rapid pace, that actually becomes doubly disruptive, because the scrap is available indeed in the local production processes in EU. And I mean, scrap is available because these countries have industrialized earlier, and steel has a life cycle of 30, 40, 50 years. So that scrap is available, while some of the developing countries who industrialize late do not have a very high quality of scrap available. There's yet another complication in this debate, which is that the scrap itself has got embedded emissions. So when scrap is used in developed countries, those emissions are not being factored in. So for example, that scrap was produced, has come out of steel which was produced with high emissions, but there's no penalty for using that. In fact, there's actually an incentive to use scrap. So we don't, neither are the developed countries penalizing themselves for using scrap with high carbon content, nor are they sharing scrap with the developing countries so that they can improve on their current emission parameter. So the whole design is actually quite complex and quite trade restrictive for the developing countries. So effectively what is happening is that the developing countries will not get a better input, but yet the expectation is that they support the burden of delivering a better output. The last point I would like to say is that we haven't even talked about the implementation issues. Ambassador of South Africa touched upon some of these. So once we start getting into next month and start data collection, there'll be much more kind of complication that we will foresee. And perhaps we can discuss some of that in the next round of discussions, Sophia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, our third speaker will be Violeta Fonseca. Hello, Violeta. She's a career diplomatic officer of the Foreign Service of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, graduated in international relations with a master in organizational development. She has more than 20 years of experience in economic diplomacy, development strategies, negotiations, and foreign trade. Among her different duties, she has been the leading negotiator of her country in different United Nations conferences, head of the Department of Training for Diplomatic Officials at the Venezuelan Diplomatic Academy from 2014 till 2016, and vice president for export promotion at the Foreign Trade Bank of Venezuela from 1998 to 1999. Currently, she's the Minister Counselor of the Permanent Mission of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in Geneva and Deputy Permanent Representative for World Trade Organization and World Intellectual Property Organization issues. So, Violeta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Voy a aprovechar la bondad que tenemos intérpretes para hablar en mi lengua nativa. Voy a tratar de hacerlo lo más lento posible para ayudar a los intérpretes y garantizar que mi mensaje les llega. Yo tengo la hermosa... antes de empezar, quiero agradecer la invitación y saludar a todos los presentes en sala y conectados. Y quiero iniciar uniendo mi voz a quienes me han precedido en la palabra para recalcar la importancia que tiene la lucha contra el cambio climático. Nada de lo que vayamos a decir en estos momentos puede ser interpretado como que no reconocemos la importancia que este tema tiene y de actuar de manera mancomunada. Hoy, lamentablemente, estamos dando el pésame a Marruecos y a Libia, pero en febrero lo hacíamos a Turquía y a Siria. Y la lista es larga de pésames que hemos tenido que estar dando, producto de las catástrofes climáticas que estamos viviendo. Por lo tanto, el cambio climático es un tema que nos arropa a todos. En mi presentación quiero tratar de dar una visión más humanista del tema. Y quisiera que enfoquemos esta propuesta de mecanismo de ajuste de frontera por carbono dentro de las implicaciones que esto tendría para el desarrollo sostenible de los países en desarrollo. Es una propuesta técnica, es una propuesta que a nuestro juicio es fría, es una propuesta que a nuestro juicio se describe como una solución o un paso más a la solución a bajar las emisiones de carbono, pero hay que verlo con lupa. El primer punto que quisiera abordar son 3 elementos que caracterizan nuestro actual contexto internacional. El primero es la realidad que estamos en crisis en cascada. Esta palabra no es mía, esta se la robo a la secretaria general de la UNTAD, que habla de crisis en cascada. Muchos países todavía están luchando con tratar de salir de los efectos financieros y económicos de la pandemia del COVID. Hay otros países que están luchando por crisis alimentaria. Tenemos conflictos, unos más visibles que otros, pero hay conflictos en todas partes del mundo. Y, por supuesto, las recurrentes catástrofes naturales, que como ya lo dije, nos arropan a todos. Con respecto a este último punto de las recurrentes catástrofes naturales y de la realidad de que tenemos que atender el cambio climático, se ha puesto en el lenguaje o en la narrativa internacional una tendencia verde. Esa tendencia verde hay que verla con lupa. ¿Por qué? Porque muchos de los países dueños de la tecnología limpia están tratando de imponernos un concepto de economía verde o economía ecológica, pero que al final lo que tiene es la posibilidad de abrir nuevos mercados y favorecer sus tecnologías. Entonces, por eso, cuando escuchemos la palabra verde, vamos a tratar de ver, escudriñar, raspar y indagar exactamente qué es lo que hay adentro. Entonces, eso con respecto a la tendencia verde. Y otra tercera tendencia que lamentablemente estamos viendo y fue aún más marcada después con la pandemia es el unilateralismo. En el unilateralismo quiero separar 2 conceptos que creo que son importantes. Uno es el concepto del unilateralismo como instrumento de política, que es las medidas coercitivas unilaterales. Las medidas coercitivas unilaterales, que lamentablemente mi país las sufre por más de una década, bueno, en el caso de Cuba, que son 60 años sufriéndolas, lo que buscan es tratar de cambiar un sistema político. Entonces, estas medidas coercitivas unilaterales son un instrumento de política, pero tenemos otro tipo de medidas que son simplemente medidas unilaterales, que cada día son más comunes dentro del comercio internacional. Y estas medidas unilaterales terminan siendo instrumentos de proteccionismo encubiertos. Entonces, dicho esto, quisiera plantearles algunas características que he identificado sobre el CBAM que me parece interesante que veamos. Lo primero, la Unión Europea ha optado por lanzar su arancel verde de forma unilateral. O bueno, como lo quieran llamar, pero ha sido lanzado de manera unilateral. Y valdría la pena entonces estudiar si detrás de esta propuesta unilateral lo que hay es un proteccionismo encubierto. Por segundo, el CBAM también actúa como un instrumento de coerción para el cumplimiento del Acuerdo de París. Es cierto, todos debemos cumplir el Acuerdo de París, pero para eso hay negociaciones y para eso hay acuerdos internacionales. Este CBAM se aplicaría inicialmente a algunas de las industrias más contaminantes. Todo eso suena muy bien. Aluminio, cemento, electricidad, fertilizantes, acero, hierro e hidrógeno. Sin embargo, calcular las emisiones incorporadas puede estar más allá de la capacidad técnica de muchos países en desarrollo. La embajadora Colelba nos ilustró bastante bien sobre las complicaciones que tiene para su país y también para el África. El CBAM es discriminatorio. Los invito a revisar el anexo 3 del reglamento, donde se excluyen de la aplicación de este mecanismo las mercancías originarias de determinados países: Islandia, Liechtenstein, Noruega y Suiza. Okay. Analizando las características que tiene esta medida, vamos a ver y el contexto internacional en donde ellas próximamente se van a empezar a aplicar, así sea de manera provisional, vamos a ver cuáles serían sus efectos sobre el desarrollo sostenible. Este mecanismo afectará principalmente a los países en desarrollo que pudieran ver afectadas sus importaciones al mercado europeo. Básicamente, el mercado europeo en estos rubros que mencioné están siendo están recibiendo exportaciones de economías emergentes, pero también de algunos países de África que dependen de esa entrada de sus productos al mercado europeo. Esta realidad en puertas traerá un ensanchamiento de la brecha entre ricos y pobres, todo al amparo de un justificativo ecológico, lo que se traduce en una afectación al derecho al desarrollo de sus pueblos. Aquí yo quisiera robarme una frase del doctor Tedros, director general de la OMS, cuando hablaba de la pandemia. Él decía que nadie estará a salvo hasta que todos estemos a salvo. Exactamente lo mismo ocurre con el tema del cambio climático. Por muy loables que sean los esfuerzos de la Unión Europea por tratar de bajar sus emisiones de carbono, lamentablemente, mientras sigan existiendo países que no tengan la capacidad técnica ni administrativa, porque también todo esto trae un embrollo burocrático, la elaboración de los certificados, el levantamiento de la data. Hay muchos países que no lo van a poder hacer. Y entonces, ¿qué va a pasar? Mientras todos los países no estén en capacidad de hacer eso, van a haber más marginados. Y cada vez que un país pierde una posibilidad de mercado, eso se traduce en sufrimiento en su población. Los estados, ¿con qué trabajan? Los estados trabajan con sus ingresos. ¿Y de dónde vienen sus ingresos? Más allá de que, bueno, puedan tener impuestos internos, pero vienen de sus balanzas comerciales, de las exportaciones que ellos puedan colocar. Entonces, esta medida, si no viniese acompañada con mecanismos de transferencia de mecanismos de ayudar al conocimiento, a la elaboración de certificados, lo que nos va a traer es aún más pobreza en muchos países y eso a su vez nos va a traer un aumento en la brecha. Y como les dije, nadie está a salvo en este mundo hasta que todos estemos a salvo. Entonces, seguirán habiendo catástrofes climáticas porque lo que pueda estar pasando en el cono sur de África o en el cono sur de América Latina, igualmente va a terminar afectando los países europeos. Eso es lamentablemente inevitable. Entonces, ¿cuáles serían las reflexiones? Primero, hay una necesidad de abordar esta temática desde una visión sistémica integral. Cada propuesta económica que se ponga en la mesa tiene obligatoriamente que evaluar sus implicaciones sociales y ambientales. Igualmente, cada propuesta ambiental que se ponga en la mesa tiene que evaluar sus implicaciones económicas y sociales al colectivo de la comunidad mundial. Segundo, y esto ya lo expresó la embajadora Colelba, el resguardo del principio de las responsabilidades comunes pero diferenciadas debe guiar el debate. No es que los países en desarrollo no reconozcamos el papel protagónico que debemos tener en esta fase tan importante que está viviendo el mundo, pero hay una realidad y es que el mundo, o sea, muchos países en desarrollo se desarrollaron afectando el medio ambiente. Y muchos de los países en desarrollo en la actualidad no tienen ni la tecnología ni las capacidades para poder estar al mismo nivel en que ellos se encuentran ahora. Entonces, la cooperación internacional termina siendo ya no un asunto de buena voluntad. La cooperación internacional es una necesidad estratégica. Si yo no ayudo al que me necesita, el mal, el dolor de ese se volverá contra mí en algún momento. Es inevitable porque el mundo es redondo. Tercero, es importante tener pendiente y evaluar esa visión mercantilista detrás del justificativo ecológico, en detrimento de los temas prioritarios para el desarrollo. No puede haber una economía verde mientras exista un capitalismo verde. Las soluciones al cambio climático también pasan por una revisión de los patrones de producción y consumo. Entonces, dicho todo esto, el mensaje, con mandarles un solo mensaje, yo creo que yo estaría contenta de mi participación el día de hoy. Cada propuesta técnica que revisemos, que tengamos en la mano, hay que verla desde sus diferentes componentes. Y tenemos que verla pensando también en el otro y evaluando cuáles pueden ser esas consecuencias en la necesidad del otro. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Violeta. Our fourth and last speaker is Rashmi Bangna. She is a Senior Economist Affairs Officer in the Unit of Economic Cooperation and Integration among Developing Countries at the UNCTAD. She's the former advisor and head trade competitiveness in Commonwealth Secretariat, where she provided policy support to more than 30 countries. She has worked as a senior economist in the Department for International Development funded UNCTAD project, which provided support to the Ministry of Commerce, India, in its trade negotiation. She was an associate professor of economics in Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. She received her doctorate from Delhi School of Economics, specializing in development economics, international economics, and econometrics. She has published extensively in referred journals on climate issues, digital issues, international trade, and foreign direct investment. She has been awarded International Economic Development Research Award by Export-Import Bank of India and has been a recipient of 2 gold medals for her research on globalization and development from Global Development Network at the World Bank. So thank you very much, Ms. Bangna. The floor is yours now.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. My co-panelists have covered extensively the issues around CBAM. And I want to highlight that what Ashish said, that CBAM is not limited to only one country, EU. It is being discussed by many advanced countries, and we might see in near future many countries implementing their own CBAMs or carbon tariffs. So this is an issue which needs urgent attention. Let me share with you the work that we have done at UNCTAD around this issue of carbon tariffs. In our Trade and Development Report of 2021, we argued that the energy efficiency of North cannot be delinked from the energy inefficiency of the South. So what this means is that we know that in the past 5 to 6 years, there has been a lot of push to countries to join the global value chains. Now, in the global value chains, what happened was that polluting industries or manufacturing activities were outsourced to developing countries, while low carbon emitting activities like branding, distribution was retained by the developed countries. Now, if you look at the global value chains, and if you look at what was happening, in the past, while countries were encouraged to link into the global value chains, there seems to be some inconsistency with the concept of carbon leakage, where now EU wants to keep the manufacturing at home and not let manufacturing activities go to the countries which have relaxed carbon laws. So is carbon tariff the only way of plugging carbon leakage? Could there have been other measures? How about, taxing your manufacturing firms wherever they put up their units? So they have to pay a carbon price to EU. So this could have been one of the ways of tackling carbon leakage. Instead, what we are seeing is that there is a carbon tariff imposed on the exports of developing countries. Now, how much does international trade add to the global carbon emissions? According to the OECD studies, 27% of the global carbon emissions, the contribution is from international trade. That means 73% of global carbon emissions are because of domestic activities. So countries need to change their production structures if they want to change their export patterns. You export what you produce. But I think Ashish rightly pointed out, the priorities are now going to be changed because of measures like CBAM. So countries are now going to focus more on their export-oriented sectors rather than their domestic-oriented sectors because of this measure, which calls for an urgent action from the governments. CBAM, according to UNCTAD's report, contributes, if you have CBAM, how much is it that you can control carbon emissions? And what we find is that CBAM will reduce global carbon emissions by not more than 0.1%. However, the distributional impact of CBAM is going to be huge. So our results show that CBAM will decrease global real income by $3.4 billion per annum. Real income in developed countries is going to rise by $2.5 billion per annum, while it will fall by $5.9 billion per annum in developing countries. And this is at the time where post-pandemic, developing countries are struggling to put back their industries, to put them back on their feet. They are struggling to progress on their SDGs. The poverty is growing, hunger is growing. At this point, the real income will actually decline in developing countries. And we have done two scenarios of carbon price of $44 per ton and carbon price of $88 per ton to see what will be the rise of real income in advanced countries. And we find that EU27 will gain something like $5 billion to $7.1 billion. US will gain $1.2 billion to $1.9 billion. And there are going to be real income gains in other advanced countries as well. So CBAM is not really addressing the global carbon emission problem that the world is facing, but it is posing more challenging, more challenges for developing countries in terms of reducing their real incomes. Now, the question is that what can be done? What is it that WTO can do to facilitate countries' progress towards their NDCs, their nationally determined commitments? We all know that all countries are as worried as EU or other advanced countries in terms of addressing the climate change. There are efforts being made for climate mitigation and especially climate adaptation in developing countries. And for this, what is it that really the developing countries need? The developing countries need the technologies, they need adequate finance, they need capacity building, they need policy space. So keeping all these areas in mind, we have proposed in our Trade and Development Report of 2022, a positive trade and environment agenda, which can be multilaterally discussed and adopted in the Committee of Trade and Environment. So CTE is the right place to discuss this positive trade and environment agenda. The premises on which this agenda is based is that there has to be incentivization for green industrialization. So countries need to be incentivized so that they can progress towards their NDCs, they can change their production structures, and they can make them more green. So the first area which needs to be addressed is technologies. We are talking about a list of environmental goods and services. Can we also talk about a list of environmental technologies or a list of green technologies? And these identified green technologies can then be declared as global public goods, and no patents should be allowed on these technologies. Now, we know that there is already a list of environmental friendly technologies because if you look at the patents given to these environmental friendly technologies, you find 60% of the total number of patents are with EU, Japan, and US. So countries can really benefit if they identify some green technologies which can become more affordable, which can be re-engineered by many developing countries and adopted for their green industrialization. The second area where action is required is in terms of finance. We know there is a lot being done in UNFCCC. We know there are debates around climate finance. $100 billion commitments are there. There is going to be discussions on the loss and damage in COP 2028. But apart from that, can we think of a trade and environment fund in the WTO? Now, there was a proposal on this by China and India in 2011. Can the member states revisit this proposal and see how, using these funds, the capacities of LDCs can be developed so that they can change the structure of their export-oriented sectors and they can build their capacities? This brings me to the third area, capacity building. How can developing countries, how can LDCs put in place climate smart digital infrastructure? So this is the kind of capacities that need to be developed, and this will require cooperation, this will require partnerships. And if advanced countries are really serious about their climate action and really worried about addressing the global carbon emissions and progressing towards their targets, I think this is the way to go forward, to have partnerships, to develop capacities of developing countries to share and transfer green technologies and provide adequate finance to them. The more important thing over here would be to provide incentives and not punitive measures. Can we think of an incentive to address plastic pollutions? For example, can we think of zero tariff regime for plastic substitutes? We know many developing countries are major exporters of plastic substitutes, for example, jute. So can we incentivize the system so that automatically within the countries, there is more incentives to go and produce plastic substitutes rather than plastic products? So this is the kind of way forward which can really help the developing countries and LDCs rather than punitive measures like CBAM. And my last point over here is that there is a need for policy space and fiscal space for developing countries so that they are able to design their climate policies and trade policies which speak to each other. But what is happening is that there is a lot of restriction. There is a lot of restrictions on their policy space. For example, can we think of a climate waiver for developing countries under SNDT, special and differential treatment, in specific agreements like the ASCM, Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, so that the countries are able to subsidize their green sectors without really worrying about the ASCM agreement? Can we think about a climate waiver in TRIMS and TRIPS so that investments can be done or incentivized by local content requirements, by using those kind of provisions which are not allowed? But developing countries need all these provisions now if they really want to progress on their green industrialization. So policy space becomes extremely important, and this is the way where WTO can help developing countries. In the CTE, the discussions can start on what are the ways to facilitate developing countries and especially the LDCs and SIDS in terms of the progress that they can make towards their NDCs. So I would like to stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we have heard from our 4 distinguished panelists different points of views and different approaches to the CBAM. And now we would like to hear from you. So I'm going to take a few questions from the audience. So, okay, we have you want? Because it's like, okay, I'm going to take that, and around here, there was another hand. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for this presentation. My name is Marcus. I'm from a renewable energy and offshore wind company headquartered in Europe, but active globally. And I do have a question for Ambassador Mlumbi Peter. Excuse me for not potentially pronouncing your name correct, but other panelists are, of course, also invited to comment. And I want to thank you all for this session and sharing your perspectives. Maybe quickly on South Africa, I think you do have a very strong potential for offshore wind and also other renewable energies, and the government is currently investigating this potential. Our company's SVP actually visited South Africa with the Dutch-Danish delegations about 3 months ago. So perhaps offshore wind green hydrogen exports could be something of the cooperation measures you mentioned. But let me come to my question about CBAM. So we as a company, we consider ourselves to be leading on sustainability, and thus we closely monitor and report our emissions, because you can't fix what you can't measure. And we do report our emissions both for compliance reasons. The EU emissions trading system has helped a lot with that, because about 20 years ago when it was introduced, we needed to make the investments to monitor and report these emissions in that systems. But we also do it outside the EU. We do it because of investor concern, because of stakeholder relations, because of our sustainability ambitions. So we do it for voluntary reasons, if you will. And I understand that the capacity to measure and report emissions in companies is different in developing countries, in particular for MSMEs. CBAM is, however, affecting heavy industries such as cement, steel, ammonia. So I'm talking in my question now mainly about the steel and the cement companies affected by CBAM and not the SMEs. Because we're in a world where we are rapidly moving to voluntary and compliance obligations for carbon emissions accounting. And perhaps this is even similar to about 100 years ago when we moved to the requirements on financial accounting. So what needs do you see for your country's exporting companies in order for them to improve their understanding of their business emissions? Is there something perhaps the Global North could help with, if you will? And because if you're large industrials, if they do not do the reporting for CBAM, they may need to do it for other reasons. Probably they already need to, because South Africa has a very established carbon pricing system. So how important do you see carbon emissions accounting as a tool to reduce emissions? Or if measuring and reporting emissions is too burdensome for the private sector in the developing countries, what other measures would you suggest so that the private sector is incentivized to reduce emissions?
Okay, I want to listen to the gentleman in the back.
Yep. Hello. Thank you very much for the panel discussion today. It's been very interesting. I'm Blaze. I'm from Australia. I just have a quick question, which is we've heard a lot about the problems with CBAM. I was interested if there are any concrete points about CBAM that would be a basis for negotiation with the EU in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another question around here was?
So Xavier Bosch from the European Commission. It was mostly a reaction. Many thanks for this debate. I think first, because the question you discussed today was about greening trade, and you discussed the rationale of the instrument. I think it's important to recall that the core rationale of the instrument is to decarbonize EU industries, to allow a greater ambition for the EU on its climate objectives because of this urgency, and because of the need to accelerate the carbon border adjustment mechanism only comes as a complement to the reinforced carbon pricing in the EU, which is under the emission trading system. So I think it's important to see CBAM not as a standalone measure, but always within mind the fact that it comes with increased carbon pricing for the whole of the production of the EU in a set of limited sectors. A second point, because you discuss CBAM and CBAM's plural, I think it's important to say, as far as the EU CBAM is concerned, that the one as it stands, the one that has entered into force and that will be gradually implemented, is limited in scope. Let's not prejudge what it can become. There will be a review in 25 that indeed foresees to assess possible scope extension, but we are not there yet. I think many of the studies you cited on the potential effect tend to mix also what is the EU CBAM as is and what could be a very extended version, either introduced by the EU or other countries. So of course we come with very different figures in our impact assessment, be it on the impact on these developed countries or developing countries, which has been a concern while designing the instrument. So this has been carefully studied, and it has to remain a point of attention, and it will remain a point of attention as part of our review. But again, this distinction is very important, so we don't, I think there will be other sessions to discuss more in detail some of the studies. The risk of, you mentioned this notion of sort of proliferation of CBAMs, plural. It's important to say that we see this as CBAM is not preventing further coordination on those important topics, such as carbon pricing, the calculation of embedded emissions, carbon intensities of products. But given the urgency for the EU to increase its ambition and to stay on track with this commitment under the Paris Agreement, I think one is not preventing the others, but the EU had to move forward. And if proliferation means a large uptake of carbon pricing throughout the world, of course, this will be for the better. The EU is actively promoting carbon pricing, and it will come into deduction of any kind of CBAM obligation in the definitive period. So this is a point. Then perhaps there were a few more implementing concerns that I will perhaps try to quickly address that were mentioned, and most notably by Mr. Chandorkar, on confidential information. This, as part of the implementing regulation, we have consulted all stakeholders. This was a remark that's been done, including by the government of India and other companies. These are elements that we have taken on board. It's important to note that there's no verification mechanism in the transitional period, and it will be in the definitive regime. These are elements that we can work on to ensure that there's absolutely no concern with sharing of confidential information. The discussion on the scrap aluminium, I think there's a misunderstanding. The way scrap aluminium is accounted in the EU in its own production process and how it will be accounted for the exporters will be exactly the same. So I hope we can lift that confusion. And I mean, of course, and if it promotes a more circular use of raw materials also outside of the EU, this will be for the better. Your concern about SMEs, it's my last point. It's an important one, the one on more downstream products. Of course, CBAM, as it stands, by and large concerns very large companies. Half of the steel in the world is produced by 40 companies. It includes, or sometimes also in third countries, EU-based companies like ArcelorMittal in South Africa. So if they face the same incentives to decarbonize also outside of the EU, this will be for the better. If it's CBAM can encourage that, this will be, of course, it will be for the better in view of the objective of the instrument for climate. And for SMEs, we have foreseen some flexibilities in the reporting requirements. So these are elements that we have very much in mind. And let me conclude that we, of course, while the primary objective, it's a climate objective of the measure, we will pay due attention, as we have done when designing the instrument in the review, to consider the trade impacts and, of course, mobilize financing, EU financing to support in a targeted way the most exposed countries. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take one more and then we're going to answer all the questions. So please, here.
Thank you so much, Deborah James from the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. It's interesting, though, when I look at the EU documents on the EU program, that it's actually specifically to benefit domestic industries. And the same as in the United States, where we have the Inflation Reduction Act. It's clear from our policies that it's intended to benefit our own domestic industries and to use green technology as a competitive advantage in the global marketplace. So you might hear here that it's intended to be fair and applied evenly, but in the domestic context, that's not the discussion that's happening, I don't think, in the EU nor the US. And the question I want to ask is actually about the role of the Secretariat. It seems to me like the Secretariat is sort of taking the developed country proposals and basically advocating for them. So, you know, taking up the issue of carbon pricing, taking up the issue of trade agreements and environmental goods and services, taking up the issue of promoting environmental JSIs, taking up the issue of you know, saying, well, let's look at buying from more green and not look at emissions of actual trade. And I'm wondering from the panelists, has the Secretariat actually advocated for any of the environmental proposals from the developing countries over the last decade or two? Because it seems to me, for example, that the food security public stockholding proposal by developing countries would do a lot for emissions. I mean, it makes more sense for Indian people to be eating Indian rice than for Indian people to be forced to buy American rice, as the US would like them to do, just looking at the emissions. So is there a Secretariat report on the economic benefits of green climate technology transfer, or a climate waiver on trims or trips? And are these things that we could possibly expect from the Secretariat, or are they still just, you know, doing lots of production around the developed country environmental agenda, which, as we've seen, is actually protectionist and against multilateralism? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, one thing that surprised me is how it seems like we underdeveloped countries never really understand the rules, but then when we apply them, they affect us, you know. And so sometimes it's kind of disturbing how we try to put our demands and nobody listens to us beforehand. So it's kind of, yeah. Anyways, who wants to take the questions and the comments that we have heard from the floor? I think it was a question directly to you.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you, Mark, for the question. As I indicated, the key issue for us is the administrative burden that is associated with the reporting requirements, the need to establish systems to be able to do this. So if there could be areas of cooperation, I think sharing of experiences in terms of systems that others have implemented that could easily be implemented in developing countries, that will be helpful. But of course, I think the critical issue for me when it comes to areas of cooperation is technology transfer. Because that will then assist in terms of building a more resilient, climate resilient production systems in developing countries. And this is where we don't see a lot of cooperation. And I think as Rashmi has indicated, the core objective for South Africa, yes, we understand the need for us to be able to do what we need in terms of our national determined contribution to reduce climate change. The more sustainable way of doing this is to ensure that we are able to encourage green industrialization. So we need to ensure that we are able to have access to the requisite technologies. We are able to produce the panels in South Africa. We are able to produce the critical issues that we need to be able to address comprehensively the effects of climate change. So I spoke yesterday in a session with Norway to indicate what we've done to encourage green investments. So if more companies can invest in South Africa and the continent, that will be great. As you have indicated, we have huge potential in terms of solar, wind. There's even in the rest of Africa, even potential for hydroelectricity. So what is important is investment-led cooperation that can ensure that we have beneficiation of resources in Africa. Africa is actually part of the solution. South Africa is part of the solution. The critical raw materials are there. But what we see increasingly is another scramble for Africa, where everyone is trying to get to these critical raw materials for beneficiation elsewhere. I think if we are to really promote sustainable development, if we are really serious about ensuring that this, of course, addresses climate change, but also contributes to meaningful integration of African countries in international trade, then we have to really look at cooperation that is based on support and cooperation on green industrialization. So for me, those would be the aspects that will be critical. And of course, we have, as the Africa Group, put forward our own thinking and perspectives in terms of how we see multilateral cooperation in this regard. Because as I said, we don't believe that we should be looking at punitive measures, but rather cooperative measures. And we have put forward a paper on policy space for industrialization that touches on digital industrialization, green industrialization, because we believe that these are the issues that would need to be covered going forward. Maybe just briefly, on the issues that were raised around by the EU with regards to the scope and, of course, the different figures. Yes, the scope may be limited for now, and you have these sectors that you have identified, but of course, there's always a difference in terms of the data, depending on which data source that you use. From where we sit, given the carbon content of our production in South Africa, what we see is that the effect will be huge. And the effect is not only limited to trade, jobs are affected. You spoke about ArcelorMittal. ArcelorMittal is currently struggling, and there are implications on jobs. So I think what we need, yes, we understand that we are currently looking at implementation regulations. I think there's a need for more discussions around how do we really address the effects of climate change. We understand that it's about dealing with your own objectives in terms of greening your own industries. But unfortunately, the impact of the CBAM is extraterritorial in nature. Because yes, what is going to happen is that there will be, in addressing the carbon leakage, there are costs to us in terms of what we need to do to ensure that our industries are able to link to your own value chains and we are able to access your market. So I think an honest, frank conversation in terms of how do we limit the unintended consequences. Yes, the objective may be a noble objective for all of us to try and deal with the effects of climate change, but we are saying there are serious socio-economic impacts to developing countries. And I think a need for a thorough conversation is required in that regard. Let me pause there.
Thank you very much. Ashish, you want to?
Thank you. Just to address the questions, firstly on the measurement part, I mean, of course, it's well understood that we need to measure. The debate is actually who measures what, and the importance of nationally determined pathway to that measurement. So I think developing countries are not shying away from that process. In fact, at least in our system, this process is very much on in terms of companies reporting their own emissions, etc., and being very cognizant of this issue. On the question on the points about the basis of negotiations, I mean, I think that a lot of that debate is happening in WTO forum. So perhaps one good place would be to refer to the, the minutes of the various WTO discussions. It would be too much to summarize in a short intervention. On the points made by the gentleman from the Commission, I think you rightly said like this was a EU objective, and the whole. I mean, our point is that it was EU objective determined by EU, but the idea was to act on it nationally, not extraterritorially, and that is, I think, the central point of contention here. That to meet your objective, now we have to do something. That was not the idea of NDCs and the whole environment debate. On the extension of CBAM, yes, we don't want to prejudge the extension, but we hope for the best, but we also have to be prepared for the worst. So we already know that there will be a disruption when the reporting requirement kicks in. So if this extends to, instead of 5 or 6, it extends to 50 or 60 sectors, all of which are under ETS, then that becomes a very complex situation for any exporting economy to comply with. But of course, we remain in very active discussion on that topic with both bilaterally and here in WTO. So I think that debate is going on. On the points made by Deborah, I just hope that our friends from the divisions which write those reports were listening to that intervention, Deborah.
Thank you very much. Violeta, ¿quieres reaccionar?
Sí, muchas gracias. Sé que estamos muy cortos de tiempo. Sé que mi reacción va a ser muy rápida, específicamente a la pregunta planteada por Deborah James, que compartimos. Y mencionar que la OMC es una organización liderada y dirigida por sus miembros. Aquí todas las decisiones se toman por consenso. Entonces, sí, en efecto, nos hace falta un acompañamiento más fuerte de la Secretaría en los temas de interés para los países en desarrollo. Ya Débora mencionó uno, yo me atrevo también a traer a la mesa todo lo que es la propuesta del G90 en el Comité de Comercio y Desarrollo. Estamos estamos en puertas de la 13 ministerial de la OMC. Mi percepción personal es que el tema de cambio climático, o sea, todos los temas ambientales ahorita generan mucho interés, pero de allí a ese interés que puede generar toda esta argumentación que está generando la Secretaría, la realidad es que aquí las decisiones las tomamos los estados y las tomamos por consenso. Y dentro de este consenso, todos los países en desarrollo tenemos cada uno un mismo peso. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Violeta. Okay, Rashmi, you want to take the floor, and you're last.
Okay, thank you so much. I just want to highlight that export revenues are extremely important for many developing countries, LDCs and SIDS. And at this point of time, they need finances for their green industrialization, and they rely a lot on their export revenues. If any measure adversely impacts their export revenues, that means that it will be translated into slowing their progress towards their NDCs and making it even more difficult for the world to achieve its climate goals. So one has to be extremely careful as to not disturb the existing value chains, not disturb the existing export revenues. In fact, try to increase the access of finance and capacity buildings to the LDCs, to the developing countries and SIDS, so that they are able to have more capacities and capabilities for green industrialization. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you very much for staying till the end. I know we're past time, and I don't want to interfere with other activities and panels at the WTO Public Forum. It's the last day, and we have a lot of debates coming our way that we still need to attend. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for listening and participating, and we look forward to keep discussing these issues.